different types of barriers. Let's see if we can sort that here. We were talking about these different types of barriers and what they work with. So we know for sure they work for Nix Hager to separate a field for Nix Hager, that if you're machzik in one, it's not considered like you're cutting the next one. We discussed if it helps Le'inyan Tuma, and we discussed if it helps Le'inyan Shabbos. We had a machlokes what Rabbi Yochanan holds. I'm sorry, Lagabe Tuma and Lagabe Peah. We had a machlokes Rabbi Yochanan held, and then the Gemara says, "Abel Le'inyan Shabbos it wouldn't work," and Rava says it even helps Le'inyan Shabbos. Titania, because we learned. And I'm just going to review a little bit from the Amud Beis. Hoitzi Chatzi Groigris. The halacha is to be over the Melacha, the rice of Haitzah on Shabbos. You have to with food. The food has to be at least the size of a Groigris. And if you only took out half at a time, so Hoitzi Chatzi Groigris from one Rishus to another Rishus, like a Rishus HaYachid to a Rishus HaRabim or vice versa, V'nicha, and you put it down, and then B'chazov Hoitzi Chatzi Groigris V'nicha, V'helamachas. So you took out two halves at a time, but in that entire time, for instance, you didn't realize that it was Shabbos. That's where your shogi was. Chayiv, you'll be chayiv because the two half of Groigris combine to become one full Groigris. But what if it was B'shnei Alomos? In between, you remember that it was Shabbos, so that separates the Yisurim, which means each action was only done on the Chatzi Groigris. You'll be potter. But Yosy Yomer, it's not enough that the two Chatzi Groigris should have been brought out Behelamachas. You need also B'shus Achas. Behelamachad, B'shus Achas Chayiv. And the case that we discussed was, imagine you have a Rishus HaYachid, and you're carrying this Chatzi Groigris into Rishus HaRabim. But the Rishus HaRabim was separated by a fence made out of this Chatzav plant, or the other types of barriers that we've discussed. So imagine you have a line of these Chatzav plants crossing across the Rishus HaRabim, so it sort of splits the Rishus HaRabim in half. And therefore one Chatzi Groigris you brought from the Rishus HaRabim, one Chatzi Groigris you brought from the Rishus HaYachid to one half of the Rishus HaRabim, and one Chatzi Groigris you took out from the Rishus HaYachid to the other half of the Rishus HaRabim. Or vice versa. You had a Rishus HaYachid that was split in half by one of these types of Chatzav plants, and you took a half of the Groigris from one Rishus HaYachid to the Rishus HaRabim, and then you took the other Chatzi Groigris from the other Rishus HaYachid to the Rishus HaRabim. So the Lach is B'shtei Rishus is Potter, and that's where it's relevant to Le'inyan Shabbos if this Chatzav or the other things in the list are considered barriers. Oh, Gavaltik, Vayhi Ar. The Omer Rabba. The Omer Rabba, and Rabba said, V'hu sheyesh chiyuv chatas b'neihem. The space in between the Rishus HaRabims had to be a chiyuv chatas, meaning that if you would have carried it from the Rishus HaYachid to that barrier, if you would have carried from the Rishus HaRabim to that barrier, so you have a Rishus HaRabim with a barrier in the middle. If you would have carried it from the Rishus HaRabim to that barrier, that would have also been the Raisa. Was it the time clock was off? That happens sometimes. Who had the key to the electrical room? Okay. So Zok to Gemara. And the Rishbam explains, Sheyesh Rishus HaYachid ben Shtei Rishus HaRabim. There had to have been a Rishus HaYachid in between the two Rishus HaRabim. Shem Hoitzi Mimenu Lahen, Oy Mehen Hichnes Loi, if you would have taken something from this Rishus HaYachid into the Rishus HaRabim on either side, Chayev Chatos, you would have been Chayev Chatos, such a significant area, Hilchach Choshev Hafsik Lasoisen Shtayim. So the question is, there's a line of plants, of Chaytzav plants, is that considered Rishus HaYachid? Probably not. So Rabbah wouldn't be able to consider that a barrier. Aval Carmelis Loy, because Rabbah says if there was even a Carmelis in between the two Rishus HaRabims, which is only a Rishus HaRabim the Rabbanon, Loy, that would not be considered a proper barrier. as the Rashbam explains, you had a valley in between these two Rosh Hashanahs, Shebin time in between them, Loy Mechalkalu wouldn't split them. And therefore, if you would have taken the Chatzi Gregors to one Rosh Hashanah and the Chatzi Gregors to the other Rosh Hashanah, they do combine. The bottom in the Torah, this area of Bika, of Carmelis in between the two Rosh Hashanahs, are bottom in the Torah, Lahacha, they're bottled to either side. Zok Gemara, Abaya Amar Filu Carmelis. A Carmelis in between two Rosh Hashanahs would be considered a barrier. Avol Pisla Loy. Now, Pisla is more like what we're talking about. Avol Pisla Loy, Kegoin Chatichas Eitz Oy Amud, She'en Gevoya Yur Am. It's not 10 amma high, and the Ein Reichav Dalet, and it's not a flat surface of 4 by 4, 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. Inami Gevoya Yud, or maybe it is 10 tvachim high, Elish Ein Reichav Dalet, but it's not Dalet al Dalet. They have a Makam tour. That's like a Makam tour, meaning it's bottled to every rishus on every side. Tafilu b'drabanan mutu l'taltaloi b'toichay l'shus harabim u'mershus harabim l'toichay v'chei mitoichay l'shus hayachid u'mershus hayachid l'toichay. A makam tour, something that's sitting on a makam tour, maybe l'chatchila transferred on Shabbos, side to a rishus harabim and side to a rishus hayachid. Same, anything that's either in a rishus hayachid or a rishus harabim may be transferred to a makam tour on Shabbos. The chivun the bottle lagarmi lahach lahach. So this is an area that's considered totally bottled to either side. Afilu midrabanan, even midrabanan, there's no issue whatsoever. The leka makam choshev shel dalat tvachim. Therefore, hilchach lo have a hefsek. So if you had a pisla in between two rishus harabims or two rishus hayachids, it wouldn't be a hefsek. I would say that our plants, our barrier is similar to a pisla. But Rav Amar. Afilu Pisla. Rav says even a Pisla, and that makes sense because Rav is the one who said that it's even a Gayel in Shabbos that these barriers are considered a hefsek. Why? Because even something like a Pisla would still be considered something choshev enough to split the two properties in half. Rav Amar Afilu Pisla machlekes or rishuyos will split up the rishuyos into two different rabbins. Or two different Rishus Hayachids, Lepoitroi Michi of Shabbos, the Legara Mimeitar V'chatzva. So that's where the Rashbam says, you see here, Rav is saying quite clearly that a Meitar and a Chatzva will split Rishuyos. So you see there are barriers even in Shabbos, similar to a Pisla that Rav said would split a Rishus. Zok to Gemara, Rav L'Temei, this Rav who holds that a Chatzva can split two rishuyos, so that if a half of Gregus was taken from Rishus Hayachid to one Rishus Harabim, and a half of Gregus was taken from Rishus Hayachid to the other Rishus Harabim, it would be potter. It's Rav L'Tamei. Yom Rava Rishus Shabbos Rishus Gittin Domi. Rishus Shabbos is like Rishus Gittin, and the Rashbam tells us that if someone's throwing a get to his wife, and she is in his property, so we know the halacha is he will be makna his property to her for the purposes of being koina again. So the Gemara in Gittin says, Hikna lochatzera, I'm being makna to you my chotzer, and then I throw the get into the chotzer that I was makna to you, you will be megoresh. But what if in the chotzer that I was makna to you, there was a pisla, and the get didn't land on the floor? It landed on the pisla, one of these areas that the Makam Patur. You don't say, okay, it's in the chotzer that he gave her, and therefore she's koined. No, because the lashon of the Rashbam is rishus. The lashon of the Rashbam is why it doesn't work. It's because the Rashbam says, where is the lashon over here? The pisla makam acharu b'fnei it's considered a separate area. Ve'ina b'chal chotzer. The chotzer hiknala v'loy pisla. He only gave her the chotzer and not the pisla. Why? The chad makam moshel inish. He will lend one place, the actual chotzer. That's what he lent her. But trei mekoymes, meaning the actual chotzer plus the pisla, loy moshel inish. He did not lend to his wife. Therefore, if the get landed on the pisla, it did not land in what's considered her reshus, and therefore won't be a get. So you see, Lagabi Gittin, there's this cheshivas given even to a pisla that it's a distinct area, not the chotzer that he gave her to be able to be koina the get. So too, Shabbos, Rishus Shabbos, Rishus Gittin done. Just like the pisla is considered a separate rishus, and the get falling on the pisla will not work to be Megarish's wife if he only gave her the chotzer. So we give pisla certain cheshivas. So too, Linyan Shabbos, pisla will be mafsik between two rishuyos. Period. What happens if it was ein sham loy metzar v'loy chatzov? What if you have a field without any barriers at all? If you dig in, how are you cleaning the whole field? So if we remember, just yesterday we had this exact shaila. Remember, we had a machlokes Rav and Shmuel, and the Gemara said, according to the Rashbam, that how are you cleaning a field without barriers? If you do 2 rows of a plow from east to west, then you're cleaning the whole field. But clearly, there are other shittas about how to clean the whole field. So, Einshom loy meitzer v'lechotzev mai, Pirush Rabbi Marinus Mishmoy, and there's a machlokes Rashi and Tosfos. Who it is Bishmoy? Is it Bishmoy Rabbi Yochanan, just addressing the old Shaila, or I'm sorry, that's what Rashbam says. It's Bishmoy Rabbi Yochanan. Tosfos says it's Bishmoy Rabbi Eliezer, and it's referring to the Hiris. Kol shenikras al Shemoy. So again, the Rashbam is learning the discussion of Lagabe Kinyan. Tosfos is learning the discussion is Lagabe Tumah. So Kol shenikras al Shemoy. If it's referred to the property of Moshe, meaning whatever is considered part of that property will be nikna when you make the chazaka in one part of it. The Hechadami, Amar Papa, the Kari lay, they call it Begargusa the Plan. And the Rashbam clarifies this a little bit. So let's see what it says. Kol Shenekros al Shemoi, Kol Shenekros Sada Echad, Belosh Nyochel al Shemoi. If you say those are Reuven's fields, those are, you won't be calling it one by making the chazak on the other. But if someone says that is Reuven's field, if that's how it's referred to, if it's referred to as one field, even though there's no physical border, you'll be koina all of the field with a chazaka. If they're all referred to as one field, with one dig, you'll be koina everything. Ki gargusa the planya, kol asada shahaya hager mashka mi boyroi kana akoel b'mokashach. The whole field that the ger would irrigate from this bar, you could be koina with one mokush because it was referred to as one field. So I guess Rav Marinus is very loose with what brings the whole field together. Just merely the fact that it's referred to as a single field is enough. See, this is a very relevant shaila because we all remember when the Twin Towers were knocked down, there was a big fight between the owner and the insurance company if both properties were one single property and therefore the limit to the insurance applies to both, or if each one was a separate property. So it's better if it's called Reuven's Fields than if it's called Reuven's Field. The nafkamin is if insurance pays for both. Do you remember that? There was a big lawsuit about that.
It's amazing that hadn't been considered for the.
I guess they didn't think it would be this way.
Okay, but you make insurance. I mean, you can like this building and this building.
Yeah, I bet you the terrorists sold all their shares in the insurance company.
There's a whole thing about before 9/11.
How many people profited off it?
There's unusual trading in the stock market.
Okay, Zot Gemara weiter. Yosy Rab Acha Bar Avia Kamei de Ravasi. Rab Acha Bar Avia was saying in front of Ravasi, the Yosy v'Ka'omar Mishmei de Rab Asi Bar Chanin. And this is what he said. Chatzuva mafsik b'nichsi ager. We already know this Gemara because we've already learned in the past couple of days, but this is what they were discussing. My Chatzuva, what is a Chatzuva plan? Omer Rav Yehuda, Omer Rav, Shaboy Ticham Yeshua the Yisrael as Eretz. This is the plant that Yeshua used as a border fence when he was marking off the land. And the Rashbam says, Beferish, not just in between the Shvatim, but even in between families. Shaboy Ticham, Bein Shevet LeShevet, and Bein Ish LeIsh. Why did Yeshua use that type of plant? It grows straight down, it doesn't infringe on either property, and that's the lesson that it tells us: don't infringe on what belongs to your friend, which is what the Rashbam said a couple of blot ago. Zok to Gemara weiter. The Omar Rabbi Yehuda Omar Rav. The cities that Yeshua listed off when he was talking about splitting Eretz Yisrael, he didn't list off all the cities in Eretz Yisrael, only the cities that were relevant because they were on the border. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol sheher eyu HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Moshe chayiv b'maiser. Any part of the land that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu, those are chayiv and maiser. But there might be lands that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Avram Avinu that were not included in those lands that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe, and they will not be chayiv and maiser, meaning they're not part of Eretz Yisrael. Lafuke mai, which lands are not considered part of Eretz Yisrael? Keni, Kenizi, Kadmoini. Tanya Rab Meir Aimer, Nafsucha, Arva, V'Salma. I don't know my geography well to understand exactly which of these areas are that are excluded, but Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, and here we're going to need David Zolti's help a little bit. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, you know which areas are not included? Har Seir, Amoin, Umayov. And this is going to become a little bit difficult because, and Tosfos discusses it, because there's parts of Ammon and Moav, the parts that were Tir and B'Sichon, the parts of Ammon and Moav that Sichon took over, that are now fair game. Yidden aren't allowed to attack Ammon and Moav. But once Sichon captured Ammon and Moav's land, those lands are now fair game for Klal Yisrael to take over. And those lands, in fact, are part of Eretz Yisrael, Leinin Meiser.
The lunar strikes a week later.
The who?
The lunar strikes.
Oh, week late, that's right. Ardiskim Asya Vaspamya. So David, Ammon and Moav, that's Evar Yarden, right? You're muted.
Correct, but it's south. It's south of. That's how. It's parallel to the Yam HaMelech.
So those were not part of Reuben, Gad, and Hatzi Menashe?
Moav is parallel to the Yam HaMelech. Ever more or less Ever Yam HaMelech, but with some exceptions because it's a squiggly line that moves.
That's all Transjordan, right? That's all Jordan.
Yes.
Now, what about? I didn't know that. I always thought that Sichon captured all of Ammon and Moav's lands. So it seems like Ammon and Moav had more land than just what was captured by Sichon, and therefore became part of Eretz Yisrael.
No, he just captured part of their lands.
Mm-hmm. So how far did their lands go? Went way past Jordan? Went to like in Iraq?
Oh no, you mean how deep was it? How far?
Yeah.
Okay, the Torah never describes that.
And
how,
north and south?
How far east it went is not described.
And north and south?
North and south, the Golan
Right.
belonged to Og Melech Bashan and surrounding areas, and the rest of it belonged to Sichon Chamari.
So it would be from below the Golan, so from the area of the Kinneret and south.
That's right. That's
so
right.
From the Kinneret to the Yam HaMelech.
Correct.
So the purple. Who's the purple?
The purple is the moon.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and the other one is Ardiskim Asya Vaspamya. If you remember all the way to the beginning, we had Aspamya as well, that it takes a year to travel to Aspamya. And there was a shaila, does Aspamya mean Spain? And the Olam asked, it doesn't take a year by boat, you get there faster. But here Aspamya for sure doesn't mean Spain. This means something much closer. That's why their Shittus hold Aspamya is somewhere in Turkey. And that would be much closer. Aspamya in Spain could never have been thought to have been part of Eretz Yisrael. But Aspami and Turkey maybe could have been part of Eretz Yisrael because they're just northwest of Eretz Yisrael. Dr. Gemara, Hayu Shnayim Ma'idim. So we're changing the subject a little bit to what's required to set up edus that will say testimony that you were in this property for 3 years for edei chazak. Hayu Shnayim Ma'idim Aisai Sha'achla Shalosh. You have one set of 2 edim that are able to establish that he was in this property and eating his payers for 3 years. So they must be familiar, and they were there watching him for 3 years, which means what they're saying is, this property doesn't belong to Reuven. We know that Shimon ate the payers for 3 years. These properties belong to Shimon. And it turns out that they were Zayman. Another set of Edom came and said, how could you have been in Toronto watching Shimon eat payers of this property for 3 years? During those 3 years, you were living in Netanya. What are you talking about? So now they were trying to wrongfully deprive Reuven of his property. The halach is mishalman lo yasakoil. They have to pay Reuven whatever losses he would have had. Meaning, we don't just transfer the property back into Reuven's control, but all of the payers, anything that Reuven lost because of the testimony, because of their false testimony, they have to pay kasher zomam. They have to pay that to Reuven. But what if it wasn't one set of Edom that was able to say, witness that Shimon was there for 3 years? Rather, it was Shnayim Berishona. 2 Edom were able to say Edus for the year of 2020. Shnayim B'Shniya, another set of Edom were there for the year of 2021. Ushnayim B'Shlishis, and there's a second set of Edom. So in fact, in order to prove his chazaka, Shimon had to bring 3 independent sets of Edom, and their testimony combined will create the chazaka. The halach is mishal shalim b'neiim. If they all turn out being zaymin, so they're all guilty, so they split the payment that's required to be paid to Reuven because of their false testimony into 3, and each group of Edom, each set of Edom, is responsible for 1/3 of that cost. What about an interesting structure as follows? Shloisha achim. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi were 3 brothers. Reuven said Edus on year 1, together with Chaim Yankel. Shimon said Edus on year 2, together with Chaim Yankel. And Levi said Edus on year 3, together with Chaim Yankel. So Shloisha achim, each one saying Edus on 1 year. The Echad Mitztar Fimoin, and there was only one other aide who was there all 3 years that was able to be part of each of those 3 sets. Hara'elu Shalosh Edus. We consider them 3 independent sets of Edus. They're kosher Edom. You don't say that 2 brothers can't be made on one thing. As the Rashbam says, Hara'elu Gimel Edus Ulahachi kosher Edusin. That's where they're kosher. The Ashata, the Kamasad High, like Kamasad High. We don't have 2 brothers saying Edus together because each brother is saying Edus on a different year. It's only the stranger that's saying Edus on all 3 years. And therefore, there's no individual Edus here that 2 brothers are testifying upon. So therefore, there'll be 3 separate Edus. But they're one Edus lazama, meaning just like earlier, the 3 sets of Edom, if they're all Huzam, then they all have to split the payment due to Reuven. So too in this case, they would all split it, which means Chaim Yankel would pay half because he has to pay his share of the third, I assume. His share of each third, right? So Zok Tegubar Viter, Masnizim the like Rabbi Kiva. Our mission is not consistent with Rabbi Kiva because according to Rabbi Kiva, there's 3 sets of Edom. So we're not talking about the brother here. We're talking about the middle case of the Mishnah. A separate set of Edom for each year, that wouldn't even be a good Edus for Chazaka. In our mission, it's clear they're good Edom for Chazaka, and if they're Huzam, they all have to chip in a third. According to Rabbi Kiva, we would have never accepted this Edus in the first place. The Tanya Omer Rabbi Yosy, so I guess it's the Shiloh was the Rebbe Rabbi Yochanan, who was the Rebbe Abba Chalafta. Amallah, he told him, Haresh Achla, Shani Rishayim B'fnei Shnayim, Shniya B'fnei Shnayim, Shlishis B'fnei Shnayim out. There's a separate set of Edom for each year. So each set of Edom is not saying Edus on the Chazak. They're saying Edus on 1 year, which is only a third of a Chazak. So Amar Loi, the Rebbe said, Harezu Chazaka would be a good Chazak. Amaloi, so the Talmud answered, and we're not sure if it's Abba Chalafta is a Talmud or a Rebbe, but whatever it was, the Talmud answered, I would agree that it would be a chazaka. The problem is Rabbi Kiva argues, Elish Rabbi Kiva chaylik b'davar. B'davar zeh. So Rabbi Kiva Omer, davar v'lechatzi davar. It says, Al Bishnai made him yakum davar. In other words, the two Eidim have to say enough testimony to prove the full chazaka. You can't have an Eid, a set of Eidim on a part chazaka, and therefore their Eidus would never have been accepted in the first place. So of course you can't be mazim them because we never would have passed anything up here. V'Rabbanan, who holds that it would be a good Eidus, because our Mishnah are the Rabbanan, and our Mishnah holds that you can combine individual Eidus, even though each Eid is not saying a complete chazaka, they're just saying Eidus in 1 year. Hi davar v'lo chatzi davar ma'avdulai. There still is a pasuk of davar v'lo chatzi davar. What is it being mavai? It's not being mavai in this case because you consider this a full davar. Now, one of the reasons why this is considered a full davar is because each Eidim is a full davar. Why? Because if we don't end up proving chazaka, our Eidus will now be mechayiv Shimon to pay Reuven Paris. Because if two Eidim come along and say that we know Shimon ate the Paris of Reuven's field for 1 year and it doesn't lead to a full chazaka, now Shimon owes Reuven those Paris, right? So in fact, each set of Eidus is in fact independent, right? So Zok Gemara, my Abdullah, what are the Rabbanim going to do? They have to be memayit something. There's a question about a woman who did an issue deraisa. She has to be punished for it, but we're not sure if at the time she did this avera, if she was a gedola, or let's say she was makabel kedushin for herself. We don't know if she was an adult. So if there are two Eidim come along and say on Monday morning at 9 o'clock we were looking at her body, at part of her body, and we saw that she had a hair above her waistline, and the other two Eidim came along, and another single Eid came along and said achas b'kreisa. While you were looking at her upper body and saw hair, I was looking at her lower body and I saw one hair. So each Eid saw one hair. That's a chatzi davar. That's what davar v'lechatzi davar is being memayit. Frank the Gemara, I don't need davar v'lechatzi davar to be memayit that, because that's a lot worse than a chatzi davar. Hi chatzi davar v'chatzi eidusi. Each Eid is saying an Eid on one siman. That means neither Eid is even stating that she's an adult. So there is no edus here at all. That I don't need the chiddush of chatzi davar to be mamayit. Ela lemute shnayim oimrim achas begaba ushnayim oimrim achas bekreisa. If two Eidim come along, two Eidim say at Monday at 9, I saw one hair up on her upper body, and two Eidim come along and said at the same time I saw one hair on her lower body. That's not a good edus because each one is saying a chatzi davar. What's the primary difference between that and our case? Whether or not the two Eidos could stand on their own. Two Eidim saying that she had one hair below her waist, that has absolutely no ramification. It's nothing. So there's a psul of davar v'lechatzi davar. But in our case, two Eidim saying that Shimon ate pears for 1 year, even if their Eidos isn't good for chazaka, it's good Eidos to be mechayev them, so they stand alone. They're independent. That is the svara that the Rashbam gives as to why there's a difference. Tosfos has another svara, and that is, as long as you see, when you saw what you saw, I sound like Kamala, as long as you see everything that's possible to be seen when you saw. So if two Eidim come along and say, come along. If two Eidim come along and they say, we saw a hair on her upper body, they didn't see whatever there's to be seen. Because at that moment, there was a hair on her lower body they didn't see. So they didn't see whatever they could have possibly seen, Lagabadi's testimony. That's why they're possible. But if two of them come along and say, Shimon ate the pears for a full year, during the time that they were observing, they saw whatever had to be seen. They weren't there the next year. So that's why there'll be a psul davar v'lechatzi davar by the two Eidim that say achas begaba and two Eidim that say achas bekreisa, but in our case it will be different. So we have two differences. A is, will the Eidos accomplish anything on its own, which was the Rashbam's svara, and the Tosfos svara is when the Eidim were there, did they see whatever they could have seen related to the Shiloh? I'm sorry? Between the Rashbam and Tosfos? I don't know, but there's a machlokes as to why this case is different. Okay, Amar Rav Yehuda, I mean, we could think of a case where you'd have one without the other. In this case, you happen to have both. They saw everything they could have seen, and what they saw itself has its own independent impact. If we could find the case that has one and not the other, that will be enough. Amar Rav Yehuda, Echad Omer Achla Chitim. The Echad Omer Achla So'ir. We have two Eidim that came along and said that Shimon ate pears for 3 years, but Reuben said, "I saw Shimon eating chitin," and Reuben said, "I saw Shimon." I'm sorry, and the other 8 came along and said, "I saw Shimon eating barley." So there is an inconsistency in their testimony. Now the maskana of the Gemara is going to be that when Edom are watching somebody make a chazaka, they're not analyzing the food on his plate in such great detail to see if he's eating wheat or if he's eating barley. The Rashbam uses a lotion. Most people can't tell the difference between wheat flour and barley flour. I don't understand it because you see the crops growing. So, but most people, especially my point of the Eidos, is just to establish that he was there. I'm not focused on exactly what was growing, right? It's like the shlemiel, the shlemazel, and the nudnik, right? The shlemiel is the one who spills the soup. The shlemazel is the one who gets spilled on, and the nudnik is the guy who wants to know what type of soup it was, right? So the Eidim could say a testimony, and it's acceptable, and they don't have to be consistent in what the product was. But that's going to be the maskana. The Havamina of the Gemara is a little bit different. Matzka for Rab Nachman. Rab Nachman thought that how is it possible that this should be a good chazaka? It must be that what happened is the same 3 years that the aide who claimed that Shimon was eating chitin are different from the 3 years that the other aide said that they're eating soirim. Because when people plant a field, in order not to suck all the nutrients out, you wouldn't plant the same product in the field year after year. So you would alternate. 1 year would be wheat, 1 year would be barley. The Rishbam even says, I spoke to farmers and they told me this is how they do things. The Rishbam actually says that. I discussed it with farmers and they told me they'll typically alternate what type of thing they're going to grow. And therefore, Rab Nachman, he misunderstood Rabbi Yehuda's halacha as follows. Elamayata echad omer achla rishona shlishis v'chamishis, v'echad omar achla shnia revius v'shishis. Rab Nachman said what must have happened over here is not that they're inconsistent, because then it wouldn't be a good edus, because he didn't chap yet that the svara of Rabbi Yehuda was that it's just that inconsistency we're not concerned about because the Edom aren't that detailed as to know exactly what he was eating. So Rab Nachman understood that Rabbi Yehuda went when one aide said that I saw him eating chitin for 3 years, he meant year 1, 3, and 5. When the other aide came along and said I saw him eating so'arim for 3 years, there must be year 2, 4, and 6. So it must be, if you have two Eidim, one saying Eidus on the chazaka that was 1, 3, and 5, one saying chazaka that was 2, 3, and 6, that must be a good chazaka, which is a problem because neither one has a chazaka. Because we know a chazaka is only a chazaka if you saw someone eating 3 consecutive years. So Rab Nachman, is Rabbi Yehuda actually saying that this works? How could you argue that's a chazaka? Amalei Rabbi Yehuda told him, how could that possibly be a good chazaka? Hasam b'shatet the kamasid mar, loy kamasid mar. One aid is saying edus on year 1, 3, and 5. The other one is saying edus on 2, 4, and 6. That you can't possibly combine these two aids. But hacha, in the case of the chitim and the sa'irim, tafayu b'chadashata kamisad. They're talking about the same year. There's an actual inconsistency. Reuben is, one aid is saying that Shimon ate for 3 years chitin, and the other aid is saying that Shimon ate for 3 years soirim. So my kalamemer, what are you going to tell me? Ben chitin l'sayr. So b'chadashata kamisadi. My kalamemer ben chitin l'sayri lava daitayu deinchi. Your whole time is that it's inconsistent. I'm telling you that people don't make such a distinction between chitin and soirim. So let's have a look. at the second to the bottom Rashbam, 4 lines from the bottom. So it's Chatziedusu. That's in the case of 1, 3, and 5, 2, 4, and 6. But the 8 talking about barley and the 8 talking about chitim are talking about the same years. Don't learn like you Rab Nachman that we're talking about alternating years. The same 3 years that Aid 1 said Shimon was eating chitin, Aid 2 was saying Shimon was eating Sarim. Those same 3 years. The Chivin the Aid is Shlema, since it's a perfect Aedus, they're both saying Aedus on the same 3 years. Yesh ala Shalashonim, since we have beautiful complete Aedus in 3 years. Ma yesh, and here we have to look into the Bach. Ma yesh, where's my Bach? Oh, yes. Ma yesh, I think it's Zion. Ma yesh psulei desoid. What other psul can you possibly think of over here? What conceivable problem could there be? Imishum de ze omer achla chit ve ze omer achla soirin. Is that the problem? Because there's an inconsistency on that. Zok te Rashbam ben chiti l'sairi la vada tayu de inchi ein mavinin yofa ben kamas chitim l'kamas soirim. I'm sorry, it says kamas. Oh, I thought it said kemach. So at the beginning, I said that you don't make a difference between the wheat, between the flour. And I said, what about the stalks? But it says kamas, not kemach, because I couldn't see it clearly. So it's been kamas and kamas. People don't make such a distinction between what plant's growing. They just know that he was there for 3 years. Okay.
I mean, if they would say with certainty that I for sure saw barley, I for sure saw.
So maybe that would be a problem.
But it's generic. I saw them growing grain.
I personally stole some fruit from the property, and I'm telling you, it was more weiter. Shloish achen ve'echad mitztar fimoin harei elu sholosh edyois vein edus achas lahazama. Okay, we'll chazir this over tomorrow, but we have a couple of minutes, so we'll start this tomorrow. It's a little bit complicated, but let's see if we could make our run to the Mishnah. But we'll still chazir this over tomorrow. Ahu shtara, there was a star. Now the halacha is if 2 Eidim sign a star, and it requires kiyum. In other words, the loiva claims it's mezuyah. So there's 2 ways you can be mekayim the star. The simplest way to be mekayim the star is if each of these Eidim who signed the star come and say testimony in Bezdin, this was in fact our signature. Now the problem is, you would think, how could I be an Eid on my own signature when they gave it up? So the way that kiyum works is, I'm not being Mekayim signature. I'm relating to Bezdin face to face. I saw that halva. So that's the 2 Eidim literally coming into Bezdin by saying this is our signature. They're also saying that what we wrote in the star is true. So it's like Bezdin was live makabel their Eidos. That's how that type of kiyum works. The Rashbam explains. However, what if these 2 Eidim are not around? They die. So then the Malva would be forced to find 2 Eidim that could verify the signature of 8A and 2 Eidim that can verify the signature of 8B. So here we had a hybrid who started of a chsimila beitre. There were 2 Eidim signing on the star, and shachav chad minayu. One of the 2 Eidim died. So one could verify his signature. The other one would require 2 other Eidim. So what happened? Also, achua the high decoy, the chad achrina lasudu yachasim is yodei deidich. So one signature, Reuven said, this was my signature. The other signature, which is Chaim Yankel's signature, Reuven's brother, Shimon, came along, as well as some other barrel comes along and says, this is Chaim Yankel's signature. So the question is, do we allow that verification to occur? The key here is that we don't allow 2 brothers to be Eidim together. And the reasoning, the mechanics behind it, the Rashbam explains is, we consider 2 brothers to be one. So if 2 brothers come to say Eidus on something, we look at it like there's only one Eidir. So the question here is, what's happening over here? Savar Ravina Lamemar. Ravina thought to say, it should be good. Haine Masnisin, Gimel Achid, the Echad Mitztar Vimoyen, each set of Edus was a separate set of Edus, and therefore the brother that says on year 1 is not talking about year 2, and the brother that's talking about year 2 is not talking about year 3. So therefore, you never have any two brothers saying Edus on any year. So maybe this should be the same thing. And the Rashbam clearly explains why it should be the same thing. Hainemas Nisin, among the third wide line of the Rashbam, the Abalga, the Shnei Achen Psulin Le'edusem, even though two brothers will be puzzled to say one Edus, the Loi Chashivi Elekechad, two brothers are always only considered like one Ed. Afilu Hachi, Machshur Elohu Masnisin, L'shloisha Achen Be'edus Karka, Echad, we allow 3 different brothers to combine their Edus, Lagabe, this Karka. Why? Each brother is saying Edus on a different year. So maybe here as well. I'm saying Edus on my Chasima, and my brother is saying Edus on the other Chasima. So it is 2 unrelated Edusin, and therefore it should be accepted. Afghan, Ha'ed Hachai made ala Chasima Shaloi. Brother A is saying only Edus on his Chasima. The Achiv al Chasimis Yadameis. So it's a separate Edus, so it should be accepted. But the Gemara says, no, we reject it. Amalei, Rab Ashi, we reject it. Because there's another complication when it comes to Dinah Moments, and that is each aid could only represent 50% of the accomplishment. So if 2 aidim come along and say, Reuven owes Shimon $100, technically half of the weight of that chiyuv is from Reuven, and half of the weight is from Shimon. If 3/4 of the weight was on Reuven and only a quarter was on Shimon, that's not an acceptable aidus. So let's see how the chips fall over here. Amalei Ravashi Midami. Hasam le'nofik nachi riva the mamana apuma the achi. In that case, you don't have where 3/4 of the money is all based on the testimony of one brother, because in the case of our Mishnah, 50% of the money is from the strange aid that has nothing to do with it, and 50% is from each of these brothers. But no one person is representing 3/4 of the weight of this namonus. But hacha nofik nachi riba de mamana apuma hachi, because what's happening is the aid that's alive, he represents 50% of the star, and even the other brother is representing half of the other half. So kumtagoi 75% of the hischayvus that we're proving that Reuven owes Shimon $100 is based on the testimony of 2 brothers, which is only considered one person, and you could never have such a scenario to work by Edus of Moments. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll be mamshech tomorrow. Hopefully we'll come to the Shvams inside. Small daf. Okay, Gavalti. Everyone should have an awesome day. Baruch Hashem, they rest.